Hello, and welcome to the latest of our podcast on cost of living. Now, it's been a little while since we last did this, and we're facing all sorts of uncertainty still. So, Hannah has been trawling through our latest survey, and I'm going to hand over to her in a little bit to talk through the sort of key findings that we're seeing. But yeah, we're faced with a whole load of really contrasting indicators. So I'm going to start with some positives. On the positive side, we are hearing that we are not yet in a recession. Sorry, I should be careful not to use that word yet. But yeah, the figures for the last half year showed that the UK avoided going into recession. So that's a positive. We're also seeing that the ONS has said that retail sales volumes increased, albeit a tiny amount, at 0.5% in January. That is a positive sign. I think people were really concerned about where we were going to be in this early part of the year. And yeah, things are better than analysts have predicted. So there are some good news stories there. But as we report on this, we have just heard that the energy price cap is going to change, and that people's energy bills are going to go up to £3,000. So yeah, suddenly we are again facing a real hit on people's household incomes. But again, there are rumours that maybe the government has a little bit more money than they thought, and that Jeremy Hunt will step in and soften the blow there. We've also got another sort of concerning thing that, we're hearing that millions of households are likely to expect a 5% increase in their council tax. And we're seeing that house prices have dropped over the last few months. And I understand that Lloyd's is actually planning for a 8% drop over the next 2 years. And again, another stat I think that came out today, Kantar are stating that food price inflation has gone up 17% on a sort of consistent package of goods. So got some sort of green shoots going on there, but some scary things on the horizon. So Hannah, given all of that, how are people coping? What are you seeing in the data?
Thanks, Paul. So this survey was conducted in January, so during the time frame that you've just been talking about, and we saw some really, really interesting data. First of all, just coming back to your signs of optimism point, very, very cautiously, we did see signs of optimism within the survey that we conducted as well. Now, the one that stuck out to me as being the most interesting was that 41% of people said that they actually had money left over at the end of the month. This was significantly up on what we saw in January. So that's a really positive sentiment coming from quite a significant proportion. Of course, it's less than half, so most people didn't have money left over at the end of the month. But the fact that we're seeing a growth in those types of people is really positive. And actually, interestingly, it was young people, so Gen Z, that were the most likely to have that money left over. 57% of them said they had a little bit of money left over. So there are some encouraging signs that people's finances might be a little bit better than the dread that they had pre-Christmas.
Why do you think we're seeing that?
So I think people have been pretty proactive, actually, in terms of starting to cut those costs. We saw, we talked about it with the transactional spend data with Rachel before Christmas. We saw really clear signs that actually basket sizes were smaller pre-Christmas than they were the year before that, despite inflation. So if you applied inflation to it, you could actually see that people just had much smaller basket sizes. So people have been really making an effort to cut some of those costs. 88% of people we saw in the survey had made a big active effort to cut their energy bills this winter. This was highest amongst those middle-aged, middle-income groups, particularly those with children at home. And a further 77% of people had said that they tried to make savings in other places like grocery and other discretionary purchases. However, only 45% of people said that they felt that those had made a material difference. Those actions had made a material difference to how much money they had in their account. So it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of how much people think this has worked. But of course, if people feel that they've got more money left in their account at the end of the month than they would have done, then that must be a positive sign. In terms of those energy savings, there was quite an interesting mix in terms of how people were actually doing that. So Older people were more likely to use thermostats and heat less rooms in their house in order to save that money. Our hypothesis is that actually some of those lower affluence groups didn't have the flexibility there in terms of, you've got a limited number of rooms in your home when you've got a smaller home, for example. So they were doing a lot more kind of community outreach, and they were, either going to community spaces to keep warm during the coldest parts of what we've seen so far this winter, and also using public facilities to do things like shower, so people possibly showering at work or at the gym, or at local leisure centres rather than doing those things at home, again to save that money. And we've also seen a big growth in people trying to cook more efficiently, so freezing food, batch cooking, storing food more effectively, minimising waste. But there's been a really clear and huge conscious effort from consumers to try and shave off any kind of additional expenditure where they can.
And in terms of things like leisure spend, now I know that we've seen in the transactional data that there seems to be a sort of trading down, and some of the more value brands still seem to actually be doing quite well. Are you seeing anything in the survey data that backs that up?
Yes, actually, and I'm glad you asked me that. So another really interesting trend that we've seen between November and January is that fewer people have said that they're cutting down on the small luxuries, like takeaways, nice treats for the house. And what we've seen is a greater shift in people trying to cut their money in more significant ways, like deferring large purchases. Now, we've talked about this before, the fact that people are putting off things like buying a first home, delaying that purchase, buying a car, going on holiday. We're seeing a growth in that, and less of a kind of shift in terms of people buying treats for themselves on a kind of day-to-day level.
Yeah, and again, what sort of with the clients that we're working with, we are seeing, tough times for some, but actually some are showing really sort of positive trading figures. So that's, again, just sort of to talk about the next podcast that we're going to be doing. We're going to have a much more deep dive into our new brand dimensions data set, which means we can have another look at who are the winners and losers now that the dust settling sort of post-Christmas. So watch this space for more of that. Okay,
Yeah.
so what other insights have you been getting out of the data this month?
So another really big stat that really stuck out to me was we asked consumers whether they'd be investing, to what extent they'd be investing in their personal wellness this year. What we found is that 49% of people said that they would be taking this action to a greater extent than they did last year. Now that grew to 60% for Rising Prosperity. So if we cast our mind back to a lot of the financial data that we've talked about in previous podcasts, city sophisticates and career climbers who make up Rising Prosperity are at risk of being some of the hardest hit in the whole country because of the precariousness of their housing situations, the high cost of their housing predominantly driving that. However, 60% of them want to invest more in their personal wellness this year, and this is particularly high. It's much lower for affluent achievers, even 33%. So there might be an interesting uptick in health and wellness this year, and as people cope, their discretionary spend might move towards that area where it hoovers up in other places as this situation unfolds.
And again, I remember seeing some stats in an earlier version of our brand dimensions data that seemed to be showing that gyms, certainly maybe at the budget end of the gym market, had been doing very well. Again, it's trying to isolate some of that from the COVID impacts, which is always a challenge in any of these statistics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you think about how you spend your weekends and your spare time, when how much money you've got to spend on that becomes increasingly limited, your choices become limited. You need to make some quite serious decisions about where you put that limited money that you've got left. And it looks as though, according to our survey data, health and wellness is going to get a good chunk of that from that particular group.
Okay. Any other sort of views on sort of areas where people might continue to focus their spend?
Yeah, so we've talked quite optimistically so far today about some of the data that we found. Against the backdrop of the ongoing cost of living crisis, there are of course going to be some more alarming figures that we pick up in the survey data. I just want to talk for a moment about the charity sector, because this was another thing that really, really stood out. Now, what we've seen, having asked people whether they're spending more, less, or the same on charity, what we've seen is a net decline in contributions to charity of 24%. So that's quite a drop in how much people feel that they're contributing. Now, there's not a financial figure attached to this, but you can really gauge the extent of which we're seeing a quarter of the population saying that they're actually donating less money to charity than they were previously before the cost of living crisis started. You can imagine what impact that will have on all the charities around the country. Now, that drop was particularly high for students. That was quite an alarming drop of minus 33%. So a third of students are contributing less than they were previously, which is very, very high when you kind of think about that as a whole population. And also we're seeing older people decreasing their contribution. So that's people 45 plus who we could hypothesize are possibly the biggest contributors to charity anyway, because they've got a little bit of extra disposable income, but we're really seeing the drops there. So that was slightly harrowing and a much more alarming stat to look at.
And did you also say that they're spending less time as well?
Yeah, so they were spending 24% less time as well, which is a harder metric to kind of get your head around, but it's a
potential squeeze from both sides because it's the volunteer workforce as well as the money on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've talked about this before, and you mentioned that actually the pandemic probably freed up money and time for people to contribute more to charity, and another COVID bubble that we saw that might have now burst, unfortunately.
Okay. Right. So on that sort of negative element, but yeah, so if we sort of come back to my opening where we say, right, we've got some positive indicators, some negative. If I got you to summarize, where would you say we are at the moment?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a hard question to answer as well because of how complicated the situation is at the moment. It feels like there are a lot of kind of contradictory sentiments around. There are cautious signs of optimism for sure, but there are a lot of things that are about to happen that could change the picture quite quickly again. So we've got the new budget coming up. And to your point at the start, we're going to find out what's going to happen by way of support for households when the energy price cap, the new price cap comes into action. And there's lots of moving parts to this, and I think what we've got here is a really interesting snapshot into how people have felt and are feeling post Christmas, which is not as awful as we were originally anticipating. But yes, as I said, there is a lot about to happen, and I think really important point to make is that there are lots of households across the country still struggling with this and are in really big financial difficulty. So despite the fact that we see this cautious optimism, I think everyone needs to remember how difficult it is for a lot of people.
Okay, yeah, and yeah, thanks for that summary. And yeah, and that sort of tees up perfectly sort of where we're going for the next couple of podcasts. That we've got a budget coming up. So yeah, I think it's too early. We talked about running some scenarios for today, but I think, as Hannah says, there's so many moving parts on this that will the government step in and sort of give some assistance on that price cap? We don't know yet. Will there be a handout to certain demographic groups? So we hope to, in either the next podcast or the one after, run some scenarios that look at how much different groups are going to be impacted. But yes, certainly for our next podcast, we will also be looking at what does this really mean for spend in specific retail sectors and retail and leisure and other sectors and potentially brands. How are people actually spending their money? So watch this space. We look forward to sharing our latest findings with you in our next podcast. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, Hannah.
Thank you very much.